pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Well, I want to start off by quoting from my favorite philosopher, Yogi Berra. Yogi says, "I'm so glad you're here today, because if you weren't here, you'd probably be someplace else." I'm going to try to tell you some things that you didn't know about the Star-Spangled Banner, but I got to set the stage first so that you know about some of the events leading up to that song and poem. Sorry, they unplugged it for me. It starts with the War of 1812. The War of 1812 has been called several things. One of the things was that it was the war that nobody won. But some historians today seem to think that the real winner of the War of 1812 was Canada. Canada got the respect of the United States. They got more independence from Britain, and they got an unguarded border with the United States all the way across the continent. The other borders all went back to where they were before the War of 1812 came about. Now, Britain provoked the war, but make no mistake about it, the Americans started it. The Americans invaded Canada to start with, and things kind of went downhill after that. But Benjamin Franklin predicted this war, and in fact, after Yorktown, Benjamin Franklin says, "We have won the revolution, but we will have to fight again for our independence." So this war is also called the Second War of Independence. The United States at this time looked about like this. The Secretary of War, Mr. Armstrong, thought that the main thing that we had to protect was the Great Lakes area. We couldn't do much on the Atlantic coast because at this time Britain had something like 700 warships. The United States had 17. So we couldn't do much along here, but we had to protect these invasion routes. We had to protect Lake Champlain, which was a direct route from Canada right into the heartland. And of course the main thing was to protect the New Orleans area. We knew that England really wanted New Orleans. England wanted to repudiate the Louisiana Purchase. They didn't think Napoleon had the right to sell that land. So they thought if they could obtain New Orleans, they would also control the Mississippi River, and therefore they could make a better case against repudiating the Louisiana Purchase. The other thing that this inept Secretary of War did was he pulled troops and militia out of the Chesapeake area and moved them somewhere else. His thought was the English simply don't have the audacity to invade the Chesapeake Bay. And of course that's exactly what they did. British ships have been coming into Chesapeake for several months, single ships, exploring the area up through here, refining their maps, knowing where the rivers were, and at the proper time, the English, under the admiralty of Admiral Cochrane, sailed his ships in here, went up one river and attacked Alexandria, went up another river and came overland across here to Bladensburg. There was a little skirmish there, but the English simply marched in almost unopposed right on into Washington. Now the United States had gone into Canada earlier, and in the very beginning of the war, and at that time they controlled the city of Toronto. They marched on to Ottawa, the capital of Canada, and they sacked Ottawa. They burned the government buildings in Ottawa. Well, almost 1 year to the day, the English came up here and started into Washington to burn Washington. Almost a year to the day. They had very little opposition. The people ran after a little skirmish in Bladensburg. They ran into the city of Washington and told them the British were coming, and so everybody started scrambling out. There's lots of stories about the pandemonium and the panic that was going on in Washington at that time. All the carts and wagons were confiscated by the government to move documents and archives and so forth out of Washington to preserve them, save them. They took them over into Virginia and found a safe place to save them, which was an old abandoned farmhouse in Virginia, and that's where they stayed until the British left. But they didn't find them. So on August 24, 1814, the British marched into Washington, started burning the buildings, burning the president's house. That's what it was called then. It wasn't called the White House. They burned the president's house. They people were leaving, taking whatever they could on their backs to get out of town. The president had to flee. After the burning of Washington, incidentally, the president fired this Secretary of War, Mr. Armstrong, and asked James Madison, who was Secretary of State, to be the Secretary of War. So as far as I know, the only time in history was the cabinet post of the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War, the same man at the same time. Monroe became the next president, of course, but Monroe was quite a character. He was also an officer in the Army, and when the president had to flee Washington, Monroe put on his Army uniform and led a patrol, scouting patrol, out in advance to find a safe way for the president to leave Washington. The city was burning. The soldiers by this time were kind of exhausted. They wanted to make camp. They made a camp in about where the Navy Yard is now in Washington. And while the city was burning and the soldiers were trying to rest, a storm came in. It was a big storm. It had hurricane force winds, a lot of rain. And that rain put out most of the fires in Washington. Washington would have burned for several days if it hadn't been for that rain. But there was also a tornado that came through the same part of the storm. That tornado went through the English camp. The next day, when the English recouped and wanted to get back to their ships, they wanted to get back to where they had provisions and safety. And the story goes that there were more British soldiers killed in that tornado than there was by American gunfire on the raid of Washington. The soldiers went back to their ship and they took with them a man by the name of Dr. Bean. He'd been captured and was taken back to be put on a ship with other prisoners. And Dr. Bean had a friend in Washington, a fellow by the name of Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer in Washington. He was son of a very respected judge in Maryland. He was rather non-political. He was not in favor of the war when it came out, but after the sacking of Washington, he became a big supporter of the war effort. Francis Scott Key wanted to free his friend, Dr. Bean, and wanted to go and negotiate with the admiral and the army commander. And to do so, he had to have the approval of the president. So he went to see the president. And He asked the president for permission. The president gave it to him. He got a flag of truce on a small boat and went out into Chesapeake to try to find Admiral Cochrane's flagship. He found it and made his case. Commander Ross, who was the Army commander in the fleet, was very much against releasing Dr. Bean. He said he'd been caught behind enemy lines. He was considered to be a spy, and Commander Ross wanted to hang him. But Francis Scott Key came prepared, as a good lawyer should, and he showed documents and testimony from English prisoners who said they had been treated by Dr. Bean. Some of them thought that maybe Dr. Bean had saved their life. They also said that the Americans had treated them well. They were well taken care of, well fed, and they thought a lot of it was attributed to Dr. Bean. They also gave Francis Scott Key a big bag of letters that they had written and asked Commander Ross to deliver them to their families back in England. Well, this so impressed Ross that he agreed to release Dr. Bean. And he said, you can go over and be on this other ship where we're holding other American prisoners, but you're going to have to stay on that ship till after we go to Baltimore. We're leaving here to go to Baltimore, and we don't want you out wandering around. So the English get ready to sail up the Chesapeake to Baltimore. Now, Baltimore at this time was the third largest city in the United States. Baltimore was quite an activity for shipping. In fact, Admiral Cochrane really hated Baltimore. He said that he wanted to burn that nest of pirates at Baltimore. He called them pirates because out of Baltimore were sailing a lot of privateers. Privateers is simply a pirate that's been sanctioned by the government. These privateers would harass English merchant ships, and in Admiral Cochrane's estimation, they had harassed over 500 merchant ships, and so he wanted to burn that nest of pirates in Baltimore. So he's sailing toward Baltimore and getting ready to do a bombardment. But to get there, he had to get past Fort McHenry, which sits out on a little peninsula right before you get into to the city of Baltimore. Fort McHenry sits right here on this peninsula. And the people of Baltimore knew the British were coming. And so they tried to get ready. And I think the history books have not given the Baltimore people enough credit for what they did to stop the English at this point. Because what was next? Philadelphia, New York, New Orleans. But the people of Baltimore got ready, and they sunk some ships right across this little inlet right here in order to keep the British, these are the British ships, from sailing up in here. The British had also put soldiers ashore down here to march overland to go up to attack Baltimore from this side. This was a very hard march. It's marshy land, wet, insect infested, and they get up here and their commander, Ross, was killed by a sniper about at this point. That kind of disheartened the troops. He was a very beloved commander. But they marched on anyway to get up here. And when they got here, they found the Baltimore people had set up a lot of fortifications here, and they weren't prepared for a long siege. They would stretch their supply lines pretty thin. They were exhausted. They decided to go back. They turned around and they went back down here to wait to be picked up by their ships. The people of Baltimore, the militia, thought the English would also try to send some troops across this way to attack Baltimore from this side. And they put a boom across here to try to stop the boats. The British did put out a lot of small boats to make a nighttime raid, and they got right in here, and the people of Baltimore had already set up mortars, and they essentially blew them out of the water. None of this invading force made it to land. Some of them made it back to their ships. Now, while the English had started this bombardment of Fort McHenry, this went on for 2 days at the rate of 1 shell every minute for 2 days. The British had guns that would reach the fort from out here, but the guns at Fort McHenry were much smaller. They couldn't reach the English ships, but they kept them off. They kept a distance between them. And during all this time, Francis Scott Key is at about this point right here. He's on the deck of a ship, watching the activities. And it's true, there were bombs bursting in air. These bombs had short fuses, long fuses, medium fuses. They were bursting in air. And this is the flag here that was at Fort McHenry. The ships here were launching rockets, the rockets Red Glare. They really were rockets back in those days. They were called Congreve rockets. It was named after an Englishman that had improved on rocketry for the military. The rockets really didn't do much damage. They occasionally started to fire, but they really didn't do much damage. The main thing was it caused fear. People that were seeing these things for the first time really got in a panic. They were very fearful of them. But Francis Scott Key is observing bombs bursting in air and the rockets Red Glare. And while he's looking at all this, thoughts are going through his mind about writing a poem about this activity. And he takes an envelope out of his pocket and he starts writing words that came to him. He's standing on the deck of a ship, and you see he's on the deck of an enemy ship while he's writing this poem. Now, the words kept coming to him, and he kept trying to mesh the words with a song that he and his friends sung almost every week. Back in those days, a gentleman's entertainment, a gentleman's evening activity, wasn't ball games, wasn't radio, wasn't basketball. It was to get together with his friends several times a week, usually, at a tavern. They would drink a little whiskey, they would eat a good meal, they would smoke a few cigars, and they would sing. And they would sing, usually, this same song every time they met. Now, this song that they were so familiar with was called "A Nasseron in Heaven." Now, it came from an English men's club in London called the Nasseronic Society. And this was the song that they sang. So it came from England. So here is the tune that goes to his words. Notice it's an old drinking song. Not only is it an old drinking song, it's an old English drinking song that the music comes from. So, oh, incidentally, if any of you have had your passport renewed in the last few years, the inside cover of the passport is this same picture. And it's got some words here. It says, "Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave?" But this is the same picture that's on the passports today, which I thought was kind of unique. Francis Scott Key was released on the 26th and in a rowboat on the way back to shore. He finished writing the words to his poem. he made his way to Baltimore and checked into a hotel and tried to refine the words and the music together, and showed it to his brother-in-law, who was the commander of artillery at Fort McHenry. His brother-in-law says, "You need to have this published. I got a friend at the newspaper office. Let's go take it to him." So he took the poem and the music to the newspaper office, and the newspaper published it under the title, "The Defense of Fort McHenry." Newspapers around the country picked up on that, and they started showing it lots of places. But about a month or so later, a music teacher in Baltimore put the music notes with the words and the lyrics, and published it as a piece of sheet music, and he titled it "The Star-Spangled Banner, a Patriotic Song." And that picked up momentum and went around the country. Now that song kicked around this country for over 100 years. And it wasn't until, I think, 1931 that the United States Senate approved it as a national anthem. When Scott was trying to write these words, you could almost hear Dr. Beans coming up from the deck of the ship and saying, "Oh, say, can you see by this dawn's early light, is our flag still there?" And those words, of course, are the beginning of the Star-Spangled Banner. Congress approved it in 1931 as the national anthem. There was a lot of anger about this. A lot of critics criticized it. They are very harsh critics even today about it, Obama being one of them. But people say it's hard to sing, the words are not all that meaningful, and we really ought to change them. I don't know about that. But it is difficult to sing. Do you know that the Star-Spangled Banner has 4 stanzas? Most of us have only heard one stanza, the first stanza. But it's got 4. Now, another interesting thing is that the third stanza is never sung. The third stanza is so anti-British, and since they're our closest ally now, it's just by custom and tradition, the third stanza is never sung. Well, that tells you the story about how the music and the words came about. I'm going to take a little bit different road now and tell you something about the flag itself. That's another thing that Yogi Berra said. If you come to a fork in the road, take it. Baltimore was a great place for the flag business. All those ships coming in and out. There were several companies that made flags. Flags wore out pretty fast, you know, in the sea air and the wind. And don't forget the way ships communicated with each other and ship to shore was with flags. So there's a big business for flags. Now Major Armistead was the commander of Fort McHenry. He ordered a flag to be made. He wanted a big flag. He wanted it seen from way out in the Chesapeake Bay. And he commissioned a flag company to make this flag. He specified that it to be 30 feet by 42 feet. He wanted 15 stars and 15 stripes. Now you can imagine these stripes. He wanted these stripes to be 2 feet wide. He wanted these stars to be 2 feet across. You can imagine just how big that thing was. Now everybody knows Betsy Ross, who made a flag for George Washington, but nobody seems to know who made the flag, the Star-Spangled Banner. Well, I'm going to tell you, her name was, get this, her name was Mary Pickersgill. She had a business, and she and her daughter had 7 ladies working for them, and they contracted with Major Armistead to make this flag. Major Armistead agreed to pay them $405 for a big flag and $168 for a small flag. The small flag, of course, was a storm flag. When the big flag was in a lot of wind or there was a lot of storm, they'd take it down, they'd put up the small flag to weather the wind. Now, that money probably translates today to something like $6,000, maybe, or maybe even more. But that was a big expenditure for those flags. Mary Pickersgill asked Major Armistead, said, well, how do you want me to arrange these stars? And he said, oh, I don't know, make them symmetrical. But don't put them in a circle. You know, a lot of flags back in those days had the stars in a circle. He said, don't put them in a circle, put them in a rectangle. And that's what she did. She arranged the 15 stars in a rectangle. And it took them quite a while to make this. They needed a big floor space to make this flag, and all these ladies working. The only big floor space they could find was the floor of a brewery. And that's where it was made. So there you have it. The song comes from an old English drinking song, and the flag was made on the floor of a brewery. I don't know what all this tells us. Congress didn't want to approve Major Armistead's expenditure. They said he wasn't authorized to spend this money. And furthermore, the design of this flag was not approved by Congress. So here we have the Star-Spangled Banner that's not approved by Congress, not really paid for by the government. The flag was given to Major Armistead after the battle. Now, an interesting thing, and the history books are not very clear on this, but the big flag probably saw the first attack, the first explosions by the English cannon. But there was kind of a storm moving in, and it very likely took the big flag down and put up the small flag. So the small flag probably saw more of the bombardment than the big flag did. But they took that big flag down. It was a monster to handle. It took 11 men to hoist it. Can you imagine how stout the flagpole must have been? But it took 11 men to hoist that flag. So they took it down, they put up the small flag. Now again, history is lacking. We don't know what happened to the small flag. Nobody knows. The big flag stayed in Major Armistead's family for over 100 years. The big flag was loaned out to a lot of patriotic organizations, particularly during the Civil War. The big flag was loaned to a lot of rallies and a lot of meetings. It was mishandled. It was tattered. It was really abused for over 100 years. This is when he gave it to Smithsonian in 1907. This is about the way it looked when it was given to Smithsonian. It had lost over 8 feet of its size just from mishandling. So the Smithsonian put it on display. The thing was tattered. There's a star cut out right here. The story is that Major Armistead's wife cut out the star and gave it to a friend. Mrs. Armistead never admitted to that, and the friend has never been identified. So we don't know where the star is. There's a little chevron that's right here that's not fully explained. Many historians seem to think that this might have been the letter A for Armistead, and the middle part of that A was lost. It was removed from the Smithsonian in 1998 to do some major renovation. They thought it was going to take about 2 years to do the renovation on this, and they thought it would take about $2 million. Well, it took 10 years to renovate it, and it took $7 million. It finally went on display again in 2008. It's now in a sealed case, protected from the weather and the light, special glass, special lighting in the room, protected by a waterless fire retardant system. Very expensive renovation. But to give you an idea, this is before it was renovated, but it shows you, give you an idea how big that thing was. These people here, and you see the size of those stars. So, there are many things to come out of the War of 1812, many observations that probably shouldn't go unnoticed. It's a shame, because the War of 1812 has also been called the war that is the forgotten war. And that was another thing that Yogi Bear said there. You can observe a whole lot just by looking. Some of the highlights of things that we probably ought to remember was the fact that we did control Toronto, we did burn the city of Ottawa, the city of Detroit was turned over to the English, the fort and the city of Detroit was turned over without firing a shot. That was bad. There were momentous naval battles on the Great Lakes. We didn't do a lot of battles on the Atlantic coast, but there was a lot of battles on the Great Lakes. And a lot of heroic men that came out of that battle. You know, Commodore Perry, Stephen Decatur, probably the greatest naval hero. And of course, Captain Lawrence, in his dying words, "Don't give up the ship." Old Ironsides patrolled the Atlantic coast, and Old Ironsides today is still a commissioned ship in the United States Navy. There was the burning of Washington and the president's house, the fleeing of the president. He was fleeing down one side of the Potomac River, and Dolly Madison was fleeing down the other side of the Potomac River. They met about 2 days later. Great stories. And all these stories about Dolly Madison and the intrigue at the White House and the parties that she gave and the many spies that attended her parties. And of course there was the Battle of New Orleans. New Orleans, the English really wanted New Orleans. But Andrew Jackson gave the English the biggest loss they have ever encountered. A tremendous loss to the British. And I'm told that even today the English history books barely mention the War of 1812 and doesn't mention at all the Battle of New Orleans. So there are many stories that came out of this event. And of course one of the stories was the Star Spangled Banner. And that's the end of this story. Thank you so much for being here.
Great.
You want this?
No, great, Jack.
It's still on, I think.
Yeah, okay. I just have one question. Do you think the British would take Detroit back?
No comment.
Is there anything else someone would like to announce or say beforehand? Okay. Yeah.
Jack, could you sing that old tavern song that the British had? Do you know the tune to it?
I've got it written down, but I didn't bring it with me. But yeah, you can find it on the internet.
Okay.
But the words are quite different. And incidentally, Anasaron that they refer to was an old Greek poet, and he was known for his great consumption of wine, his gourmet food, and the parties that he gave. So that's how they remember him.
Have more questions for Jack? Well, thanks everybody. Next month, as I said, Dr. Miller will be our program, and thanks everybody for coming.
You'd be a good teacher, Jack. That was good, wasn't it?
Learned a lot.